Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Beth Amorosi, and I want to welcome you to the RNN Masters of Sustainability webinar. RNN, the leading sustainability media and business platform, is excited to present our brand new monthly webinar series. On the third Wednesday of every month, we present invigorating and thought-provoking educational opportunities to learn from leaders in sustainability from business, government, academia, and philanthropy. We're not only making an impact on the environment, but also leveraging sustainability for profitability. We hope you enjoyed this month's webinar featuring Dallase Scott, Director of Change Management at GreenerU. GreenerU believes colleges and universities are uniquely positioned to be leaders in climate change and accelerating sustainability. As the Director of Change Management, Dallase has leveraged her in-depth knowledge of behavior theory and the operations of higher education to support GreenerU's clients with the adoption of new initiatives on their campus from conception through implementation. Before I hand it over to Dallase, I just wanted to touch upon a few quick housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute throughout the presentation, and I'll be moderating a Q&A following the presentation, so you can submit your questions over email, and I will field them to Dallase. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Dallase Scott.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. And I would like to thank RNN for inviting me to present today as part of the Masters of Sustainability webinar series. Just to follow up with what Beth said, along with an email, there's also a Q&A box as part of this webinar where you can submit your questions as well. So my name is Dallase, and I'm really excited to present what I'm going to be talking to all of you about today. First, a little bit more about GreenerU. This is touched on in the intro, but again, GreenerU believes colleges and universities are uniquely positioned to lead the world in mitigating climate change and accelerating sustainability, and our mission is to help them. We are located in Watertown, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, and we have worked with over 25 institutions in the New England and Northeast area and a little bit beyond. We have been able to help our clients advance their unique sustainability goals, whether it be energy reduction or implementing a new compost program, by addressing infrastructure challenges, recognizing the need for thinking through operations, seeing through to the culture and communication of a project, and putting together strategic planning to outline goals, process, and all of the items that I just above. We're a solutions-based approach. In that, we recognize that part of the challenge can be identifying what the challenges are to begin with. So we work with our clients from start to finish. Through that process, we're engaging stakeholders, developing buy-in, thinking through implementation, always with our eye on reducing energy consumption and recognizing that there's a unique human perspective in everything we do, even when it is the nuts and bolts implementation of putting in a new boiler or thinking through HVAC. For today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the behavioral piece of what is often looked at in energy efficiency projects. A lot of people focus on sort of the technical fix, but by combining both behavior and communication along with the infrastructure fix, there's a lot more you can get from your program. So I'll touch on what shapes our behavior, behavioral change cycles, what each individual goes through in changing our behaviors. And I also have an example from work we did with Brown University that I'm going to use as a framework for talking through some of these concepts. And at the end, we're going to leave time for questions. So once again, if you have questions, please submit them in the box for Q&A. I'm going to start off with this quote. It's from David Orr's article, What is Education For? And I really love this article. One, it's a little history of how I got into this field. I realized that I want to focus on and spend my time in higher ed after reading this article. Because in his article, he calls into question the means and the goals of education, putting in play that with the thought that with enough knowledge and technology, we can manage planet Earth. And the reason why I am fascinated by this is because we talk about, and often in conversations when we think about our current challenges, there's a lot of discussion about what we need to do in regards to technology. And this appeals to our fascination with digital readouts, computers, and buttons. But to paraphrase more of this article, the question is and the topic that David Orr talks about is what could be managed as us. But this is often avoided because it's a hard choice. And it implies working in politics or morality or ethics or our own personal behaviors. And that is definitely the crux of most of the problems that I've seen in working with different institutions. So as we see here, the question and the comment for the group is, it makes far better sense to reshape ourselves to fit a finite planet than to attempt to reshape the planet to fit our infinite wants. And reshaping ourselves leads to thinking about our behaviors and changing our behaviors. So with that, I have a little Webster's Dictionary version of definition of behavior here, which is the response of an individual, group, or species to its environment. So I think a lot of this, for many of us, when thinking about our current behaviors, some of this is instinctual. I think we understand that our family life and the different things that have occurred to us throughout our time has created and made our behaviors today. And there's a lot of research that has looked into human behavior. So I just want to put out up front that this is just a high-level overview to provide some context in thinking about when you're addressing energy efficiency or working on other infrastructure type projects, things you should consider. So there are three key things I'm going to start off with in thinking about what shapes our behavior. One is motives, the other being social norms, and lastly, physical factors. And this is something that both companies and advertisers have thought a lot about, the health industry, and even in the field of sustainability. So I'm going to start off with motives here. And normally I do my presentations in front of a big group of people. And so those of you who've been a part of those presentations that might be on the webinar today know that I speak a lot with my hands and with my body. So I'm going to do my best to present all of this today with just this PowerPoint here. And I also like to get back and forth when it comes to asking questions to the audience. So I'm also going to do my best here to allow, I'm going to pause to allow you to think about what your response would be if this were a in-person presentation. So in regards to motives, there's intrinsic motives and there's also extrinsic motives. And with the picture that I have up here of the traffic signal that is red light, I would first think about what would be an intrinsic motivation to stop at this red light. So intrinsic motivation refers to motivation that is driven by an interest or enjoyment in the task itself and exists within the individual rather than relying on external pressures or a desire for reward. So very quickly, I'd be interested if everyone were to just think about what would be an intrinsic motivation for stopping at a red light. Often the response that I hear is that I would stop at a red light because it's the right thing to do, because I wouldn't want to be responsible for injuring another person if I were to hit another car going through the red light. So it's within myself and not for no other reason that I am choosing to stop at this red light. An extrinsic motivation refers to the performance of an activity in order to attain an outcome. So whether or not this is also intrinsically motivated, an extrinsic motivation motive comes from the outside of the individual. Often we see this with the example of getting paid money for good grades. Or another thing is a threat of punishment following by a misbehavior. So when I ask groups of people what would be an extrinsic motive to stop at a red light, the response is, I don't want to get a ticket. I don't want to get caught, right? So there's two different pieces here when we think about intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Both of those are going to influence our behavior. Great. So the other way that our behavior is shaped is through social norms. And I think this is something that is just part of our day-to-day life in many ways. So we're thinking about advertisement. That's when you've walked out of a store with 3 things that have zero intention to buy. All of those are influencing our buying behaviors. We have politics and policy. Whether or not you stop at a red light has been part of legislation. All of these things have influenced our behaviors. Businesses, the business that you work in, the type of education, where you got your education, health, law, religion, all of these pieces can shape our personal behavior. And I think in our family units all tie into this. And a lot of our current behaviors that we have today are based on this sort of interwoven intricacies of these social norms we've been a part of. So the graphic I have here of the social media is really interesting, especially into today's world in regards to how people have put a lot of thought in social media as ways to influence our online buying behaviors, but also most recently we've seen how social media and those social norms also influence voting behaviors. And this last one here is physical factors. I think the easiest way to describe physical factors as a way that shapes our behaviors is the idea of thinking through, if a door is open, you would walk through it, and if a door was closed and locked, you would not. So that's a physical barrier in and of itself. But there's also other pieces that can tie into that as well. So accessibility, reliability, and also climate, being like cold versus warm, that can change my behavior of how I dress or how I adjust my environment to be comfortable. So within this physical factor, I gave this example here of a bus and public transportation. So a personal experience for me is that I grew up in a place where there is very poor public transportation, and I think the bus might have come every hour if it came at all. So there wasn't a lot of access to public transportation, and B, it wasn't very accessible or reliable. And lastly, there's often snow on the ground, so that was a barrier as well. Now, moving to the Northeast, specifically in Boston, there's a lot more access to public transportation. But I didn't have a smartphone when I first moved here, and so I was still kind of hoping that I would catch the bus when it came by, and I wasn't sure if I just missed it or if it still was about to come. And I recognized that the advancement of having a cell phone with an app that can track the bus significantly increased my behavior of transportation. So that, for me, is a great example of a physical factor here. And at this point, I'm going to ask Beth, you have a cursor on the screen, so potentially if you could move that out of the way, that would be fantastic. All right, thank you. So again, these are the three key pieces that can change our behavior: motives, both intrinsic motives and extrinsic motives, social norms, and also physical factors. All of these things, especially on sort of this macro level, support our behavior. This next slide here talks about behavior ability elements. And this, I've seen a lot of these types of icons in the work that I've done, but the Stanford Persuasion Tech Lab has really thought a lot about these ability elements. Basically, all of these different icons represent ability elements which can modify behavior, either to increase desired behavior or decrease undesired behaviors. So what I show here is infrastructure. So we can think about, again, the example of a locked door. You don't want people walking through a gate. You don't want people walking through the door. One way is to add infrastructure, so a lock or a door in and of itself, and that would modify people's behaviors. Money, we see this a lot of either taxation or discounting something to either increase or decrease the purchase of an item. In regards to brain cells, this is how complicated it is, how many steps someone has to take in order to perform behavior. If you make it really challenging, people are less likely to follow through with the behavior. Or in sort of the Amazon Prime case, you can do one click and it makes it very easy for you to buy something and have it in front of your door, which is why they encourage you to put your credit card information right then and there and hold on to it. Time is, if we can make it simple, if we can reduce the amount of time it takes for someone to do it, the more likely to be on board with their behavior. The social deviance piece is really, are you going against the social norm, or are you part of a social norm? And we have a desired behavior to be part of a social norm. And so this is the constant messaging of using celebrities or in crowds to encourage people to adopt a new behavior. There's also the routine and recognizing you have a daily routine, you see a lot of advertisers try to tap into that. In fact, there was a fantastic article and research that was done regarding the Target store where they tried to identify behavioral patterns when you're starting a new chapter of your life, say getting married, which is why they want you to use their registry, or having a child and use their baby registry, because they know that you're going to be adopting a lot of new behaviors because of these big changes in your life, and you're more likely to maybe choose to start shopping at Target when before you didn't. And then lastly, there's the physical effort. And we've seen a lot of this, for instance, in health industries and cafeterias, where just simply by moving the junk food farther away from people's eyesight and making the healthy food easier to access can influence people's eating behaviors. So all of these are considered behavioral elements. And the last thing that I want to share with the group before I dive into this case study is thinking about the stages of change. So this is a behavioral change model. And with this, I'm talking about how someone can go from being unaware that their current behavior is causing harm to either them, like their health, or others, or in this case that we talk about the environment. How do they move from being unaware all the way through the cycle to sustaining a new behavior? Now, this model is a little simplified in that it shows that you can relapse to an old behavior. So it's not perfectly cyclical, and often it's a spiral where you might have adopted a new behavior and learn more information, and then you continue to grow and adjust that behavior going forward, but you wouldn't become unaware of the item once you've learned about it. So when it comes to when I've worked with institutions, one of the things that we've talked about is recognizing that people want and are trying to find ways to change for people's behaviors. And their first thing that they often do, and often the only thing they do, is do an awareness campaign with the thought that if only they knew about this, they would change their behavior. And although awareness is an important first step, awareness does not lead to behavioral change. There's other steps that need to go a part of this, and that's because when you're thinking that all you have to do is move someone to being aware of the problem, your assumption is that they would be immediately intrinsically motivated, right? If you were to tell them that, driving short distances when you can walk there is, more CO2 than putting a greenhouse gas footprint that you don't want them to do, you're assuming that this intrinsically motivated to change their behavior based on that. And as we talked about with the behavior elements, there's a lot more that goes along with that. So for an example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a project that we did with Brown University. And anyone that lives in the Northeast has probably experienced the challenges of windows being open during the winter months. So I want to quickly note that if people are interested in learning more about this, on the upper right hand of the screen, there is a media library that has a white paper that goes into detail about the study. Because it was a 3-year project, and we put a lot of thought into this control group and experimental group going forward, but I'm only going to lightly touch on it today for the sake of time. So the winter woes that a lot of universities face is that there's these big, beautiful buildings that are 100+ years old in many cases. There's often a single source of heat, and often multiple buildings are pulling, during the heating season, pulling their heat from that source. It's either the heating is on or it's off. It's not like a car where you can kind of turn it on and off depending on whether you're warm or cold throughout any season. And so what we were seeing is residential halls are being overheated, and occupants who had no control of the temperature within their space opened the windows, which often just led to creating more of the heating demands in the space, which made the heaters work more and just exacerbated the problem. So one of the questions that we had in starting our conversation with Brown, and what they wanted to know is, what is their goal here? And what they wanted was to, we asked the question, what is the desired outcome, whose behavior needs to change, and what are the current behaviors? And through that, we knew that students were opening their windows during the winter months when the heating was on. And so they had a goal to reduce energy by closing windows during the winter. Now, so in this case, they wanted to make sure that at the end of the day, the students, their audience, was landing in the sustained change, the new behaviors of opening the windows or closing the windows replaces the old behaviors of leaving them open. The next question we asked is, so what's the current state? Where is your target audience? Are they completely unaware that this is a challenge and this is an issue for Brown? Or are they aware and they want to do something about it, but they're only in the preparation, they're not quite ready to act yet? In order for us to find that out, we did a baseline assessment. Often, when people are in the facilities region, and if you're working a lot within energy efficiency, everyone understands that you need to do like an ASHRAE level audit before you would do energy upgrades, so you can get a baseline of knowing what the energy is. So what often is skipped is sort of the cultural audit or the behavioral audit, and that is something that GreenerU does with any of our energy audits, is also a culture and behavioral audit that comes with this. So what we did with our baseline is we do walkthroughs, observations, and interviews and focus groups to get an understanding of people's perceptions of the current situation, understand their values and their beliefs, and recognize that their current behaviors and most importantly, what their barriers are in changing their behaviors. So at the end of the day, what we learned is that the current group of students, they were in the pre-contemplation, didn't know that this was even an issue, to contemplation, they were aware that this is probably not a best practice as far as energy efficiency goes, but they had no intention to act because they were very uncomfortable in their rooms because they were overheated. So we had to think through a process that would support the movement all the way, again, to this maintenance, the sustained change. Now, with our findings, here are some of the barriers that we discovered. The first and the most obvious, and Brown is very much aware of this, was the infrastructure. As I said, no students at that time had any other way that they knew of to have their climate more comfortable. So they didn't want to go to bed or stay in a 90-degree room, so they were using the windows to open it. So definitely there was an infrastructure barrier there. Also is awareness and recognizing what it would take to support this process. And this kind of went to Brown's facilities. As they recognized this as a challenge, but did they have all the staff that they needed on hand to actually implement the infrastructure process as well? Time was another challenge. We didn't want to provide an alternative to students that was going to take up a lot of their time, so we wanted to have easy access for them. Recognizing that students have developed a routine over the years, especially seniors, that when they're hot, they open the windows, so we recognized that that was definitely going to be an ability element we wanted to be aware of. And again, the physical effort, it had to be easy in order for, we think, for the program to be successful. So there was a number of things that we needed to engage with to make sure we thought through this in a programmatic approach. So in developing this programmatic solution, we touched on a number of things. So you might recall, again, we have the ability elements at the top and also different ways that our behaviors are shaped on the bottom, and I'm going to tie them together now as part of the presentation. So in regards to physical factors, one of the things we did was to install TRVs, or thermostat radiator valves, to all the radiators. So before this piece, this little radiator valve was not part of it. So all the heating that came on would be either all on during the winter or not on at all. And this allowed during the winter for them to have a little bit more control of how much heat was coming into these radiators. There were additional infrastructure upgrades that we did as well in regards to weatherization, making sure the windows weren't leaky, and also upgrading their heating systems in general to be more efficient. So that was a big important step to making sure, to thinking about the behavior change piece of this. The next piece, again, in the social norms, is recognizing there had to be an education campaign, not only because we recognized there was going to be years of habits that were developed, but also that Brown has a mission to educate their students. What they didn't want to do is teach their students that opening up your window it was a good practice. And so they wanted to be very cognizant of making sure that this was an education campaign, not only for personal behaviors, but as a campus as a living lab experience as well. So one of the things they did was add behavioral cues at the point of decision making. So we had these little note here that said, you have the power to turn down the heat if your room is hot or stuffy, focusing on recognizing that they might be uncomfortable. And again, we put this where they would normally open the windows was this cue of, remember, you have a new way to adjust the temperature, and also reminding them that they now have control of this, which is part of their routine. We're put a reminder in place of where their normal routine is, and also letting them know that it's easy and you have the power to do it. The other piece is recognizing we wanted it to be a social norm. And so we worked with doing training on the Brown's Eco-Rep team. So they did dorm storms and had a face-to-face interaction with all the students. Because when it comes to influencing behaviors, the more personal it can be, the better. And so in this case, we were thinking about reminding that the Eco-Reps reminded them of the routine and how easy it was, and that it took no time at all, and that they should be a part of it. We also, in regards to making it a norm and making sure people could recognize how easy this could be in a new behavior, is we set up a mock dorm room outside as part of our energy showcase. And during that time, we tried, those students who took part were asked to put facilities maintenance number in their cell phones, so if they had any issues, they knew who to call, because we wanted facilities to address any challenges instead of students kind of opening the window or taking out their toolkit to try to fix a problem, which usually always ends up with a bigger problem than what started. And during that time, we used social norming through pledges for people to write down a pledge that they are going to follow the 3 simple steps during the winter, which is to close the window when the heat is on, to use the thermostatic radiator valve as a way to control the temperature in the room, and lastly, to call service response if they have any issues. So again, keeping it simple and making a public pledge to take part in this process. And each one of these pledges were put on the outside of each individual's dorm room. And then the last piece, again, is thinking about what motivates them, so intrinsic versus extrinsic. I'm sure some of the messaging about the impact of energy efficiency and that Brown has climate commitments could motivate many students, and were intrinsically motivated. But we recognize that we wanted to tap into other things that people might be intrinsically motivated to do, and that's to personally stay comfortable. So instead of putting all of our focus on messaging around, you should do this to save energy or you should do this to save money, students weren't particularly interested in that. They were very interested in staying comfortable. And so that's why all of our messaging to the students was how to stay cozy this winter with the easy steps you can do to stay comfortable. So there was always as easy as 1, 2, 3, and always focusing on why they would want to take part in this program, not why the Eco-Reps or myself would want to take part in this program. So those were big pieces of it. And at the end of the day, what we saw, and again, I want to stress that this was the important mix of both the infrastructure upgrades, which is a huge part and majority of energy savings that we saw over time. And right here, you can see the baseline versus actual use, and over time, the cumulated difference of energy savings from this program that we ended up implementing through all the dorms on the Brown University campus. And then again, here's the results with electrical savings, being able to see the baseline versus actual, and seeing the cumulative difference over time there as well. The other piece was recognizing that there was a communication piece that we wanted to reach out to. So we had surveys that we've sent out annually as part of this process, and there was questions about I open the window when the heating is on. We had, again, I mentioned, and this is in the white paper that you can find in the media library, we had questions of whether you open the window, and we had control groups who only got infrastructure upgrades, and then we had experimental groups that got infrastructure upgrades and this communication and behavioral tie-in. And we saw that there is a difference between those who received the engagement that were 14% less likely to open their windows when the heat is on. And then also what we saw was the infrastructure upgrades and engagement. We saw 11% to 1.6% decrease of the windows open. So it just showing that the combination of the two is really important. And I think this is with infrastructure alone. It was engagement alone reduced open windows from 4.4 to 1 over 3 years. But what we realized is that 1.6%, like where that lies, because we were able to address sort of the general comfort level, other reasons in follow-up that we found out was, potentially roommates were smelly or that they might be doing something in their dorm rooms they shouldn't. So windows were being opened, but from our follow-up, it was mostly due to other things other than being too hot. And then the last thing that really showed that our communication worked was that we, as I mentioned before, we wanted our occupants to call service response if they had any issues, because we wanted Brown to be the one to address and see why heat was buildings were either too cold or too hot, and not have the students try to troubleshoot on their own and waste energy. So we saw a 51% higher call rate in dorms that had the engagement than those who didn't. So that, to us, showed us that there was definitely behavioral change with the students' use of phone calls to service response. But I also want to pause here in regards to the service response call. During this pilot process where we were doing this experiment, one of the things that we really focused on, because through our questioning was who's our audience, whose behaviors are we trying to change or modify here, it was thinking about the students in the dorms. One group of people that we did not think about in regards to behavior was building operators. So we had a lot of requests and a lot of action that we told the students to do. And what we found was, because of all these service response calls, we found out that we had a new stage of change that we had to work on, which was working with the building operators not to change set points due to cold calls or hot calls. Because what we found with the experimental dorms, there was a change in set points, which could, if not caught, skew energy savings and also cost the institution money. We were able to catch it ahead of time, and what it did was allow us to think about this next stage of behavior with building occupants. So the next goal, and this is the sort of work that Brown continues to do now, is energy savings through building operator training. For them to be cognizant of the new heating system that's in place, and that if there are cold calls or hot calls, to try to get to the root cause of the issue, potentially air in the pipes or something, instead of just changing the set point of the building. So through this process, we learned a lot, not only about tapping into the culture and the behavior of students, but how important that is to think about that on sort of the management level as well, and building operational level. So at this point, I'm going to stop and open it up to questions to see if anyone would like to ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dallase. This is Beth. I actually do have a few questions to kick things off. I guess the first thing is, what have you found to be the best practice to prevent occupants from relapsing into old habits? And who do you put the onus on to prevent relapse and to facilitate the maintenance of new habits?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when it comes to changing a new behavior, you have to think about what I like to call future you. So something that might seem like a good fix in sort of a short timeline and in one building Once you think about, can I sustain this for the next 5, 10 years? And also, is this project even scalable? That's usually where relapse can happen, is because it takes reminders and it takes a lot of practice for people's, for adoption of behaviors to become habits. And so what I would suggest is it's better to take a bite-sized piece of behavior that you're hoping to adopt and really make sure that has been fully adopted and part of the habit of the culture and of your operations before trying to change big behaviors. The other thing that I suggest is that try to focus on behaviors that might be just one-time asks, right? So in regards to focusing on getting building occupants to purchase Energy Star equipment, you do a big push, and it might take a lot of energy to do that behavioral campaign, but that one campaign is going to continue on. The benefits from that are going to continue on, versus trying to do a program which is constantly chasing people for them to have more sustainable behaviors, which is why you see a lot of automatic occupancy sensors doing the job for turning off the lights in a lot of spaces.
Great, thank you.
Oh, I forgot to mention who's responsible for it. I think that needs to be discussed at the very beginning, and it should be someone who is comfortable and confident in making sure that when it comes to specific behavior that they know should be followed, that they're good at being accountability coordinators in that sense.
Great. The next question is, what do you find to be the most challenging hurdles in getting students, or in many cases also the building managers or the people that you're working with on the campuses to to change their habits to benefit the change you're trying to impart?
Right. So I think for me, with students, and I'm sure everyone who works in higher ed can recognize this, they are only there for 4 years. So it can be really challenging to have a program that is focused on students, and we just have to reinvent it every year for the incoming students who don't know this. Now, that also can be a benefit as far as setting expectations and creating social norms. So I think that's the biggest challenge on the student side, is recognizing that there's so many competing messaging out there that it's hard to make an impact through all the noise, and that they're only there for a short amount of time. I think that a good strategy is, and this is sort of our learning outcome, is to focus on the change and culture creators on campus who every year are a part of the engagement process. So I think you're going to get more bang for your buck thinking about how you can influence behaviors and create culture norms to the people who run orientation every year. Then you personally try to invite and shake the hand of every new incoming student. So any way that you can interweave it into the fabric of what's already established at your institution is important. And I think this can be true for any organization, is how important, because we're developing new habits, how important those first few months of onboarding a new staff member or kind of getting a student acquainted with their campuses. And I think often we feel so fatigued at that moment of onboarding that we don't put as much effort and energy into that we could.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next question is, what part of what you're doing, or a large part of what you're doing, gets at the question that every market researcher wants to ask? How do you reach kids ages 18 to 22? And have you found yourselves implementing marketing strategies targeted at reaching that demographic in order to facilitate change? That said, I know that students are probably the lower hanging fruit for you, and it's more about getting, the people that are, embedded, ingrained, have old behaviors ingrained in them, and meaning the status quo, the establishment that you're working with on the campuses. So maybe you could just address, for the audience's sake, your experience in marketing to the students, as well as what you do to reach the other parts of your audience that you're trying to implement change with?
Yeah. So in regards to students, that's a tough one. And it really, not only are these students going to be kind of changing and evolving every year. I know when I first started working, it was like Facebook and Twitter, and now it's like, don't bother with those things, Instagram and Snapchat. There's all these things of how do you communicate with students that can be challenging. I think there is just basic kind of human desire and instincts that come into play when it's trying to reach out to them. And it's all those ability indicators. If you make something more challenging for someone, they're going to be less likely to do it. You make it easier for someone, they're going to be more likely to do it. So I think sometimes there's these really basic things that people can still follow to support that. Money can be definitely an influencer if you want to make it more accessible and less expensive for people to fill up their water bottles. They're less likely to purchase single-use bottles. So I think that's a big piece of it. But as you did mention, I think to spend time and focusing on the environment that because behavior is reaction to people's environment, right? So spending time really thinking about how the current culture, how the current environment, being the faculty, the administrative team, the people in the dining hall, all of these, you have an opportunity to support new behaviors by modeling behaviors. And I think younger generation will sniff out hypocrisy very quickly. And so if you're not willing to work with your staff and kind of thinking about the culture of sustainability on your campus, the students are going to be kind of rolling their eyes at your request for them to be more sustainable when you're not.
As a follow-up to that question, were the students more receptive to change than the staff or vice versa?
That's a great question. And so in this, I think the students were definitely receptive to change. I think, again, because one of the biggest barriers, and it's like the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room, was that students did not have ability to control their heat, and then after the program they did. So if you sell it to them and we talk to them about like how huge this is and a benefit it is for them to be able to now control their heat, they were like, sold, this is a piece of cake. I have no problem with this. So it was definitely more challenging to think about the habits of the building operators and really kind of understand, because that's the complexity of the challenge. Like, is it an actual challenge with the set points, heating set points, or like it takes a lot more time and energy and potentially money to resolve the root cause of the heating challenge or heating and cooling challenge. So I think in the long run, it will save a lot more money by focusing on the building operators, but definitely can be more challenging.
And how long do you think it takes for changes in a campus community to show real tangible results? Is there a break-even point where a campus community either seems to adopt a change into its accepted culture or reverts back to old ways and relapses?
Oh, wow. That's it. So I think there's two things, and I talk about this quite often. I think there's the culture change or the ethos of the campus, and that is, for me, a marathon. That is a long time of really thinking about your messaging, really thinking about the behaviors that you're modeling, having leadership that has full buy-in and their messaging sets those expectations out of the gate. So that can definitely be a long game. But I think there definitely are short-term, easy-win behavioral programs that you can put in place. And again, a lot of this can be in reducing, for example, reducing the costs of more sustainable office products. You know, if you were to, move them up higher in the shopping cart, for example, when people are ordering office supplies, and you even put an icon that says, like, preferred vendor, those are small little tweaks that you can do that don't cost a lot of money that would influence positive behavioral, sustainable behavior change on your campus.
And were the results of the energy savings communicated, and was there a dashboard?
So they were communicated in regards that is a good question. The energy savings were communicated to Brown facilities, but it was not communicated like building by building, as far as I know, to the stakeholders. The communication really is on a higher level of Brown's commitment and how close they're getting to reaching their greenhouse gas reduction commitment. They do have annual reports, and they do touch on like waste reduction and energy reduction. But in my role in the program, we didn't do direct outreach on that.
Okay. What have you found, I guess, do you notice that there's motivators, certain motivators for change, and have there been any that, have surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience over the past 7 years working in this space, specifically at GreenerU, has been the importance of leadership. I absolutely believe in grassroots movement, and I know that students and faculty and staff have been movers and shakers to make things happen. But it is astounding what a solid buy-in from the leadership and organizations can do in regards to making things happen on a campus. And so I think for me, if anyone in a leadership position is listening, to really dig in, and I think you still obviously want that grassroots approach, but you have to be able to meet them halfway with a top-down commitment, and as part of that commitment, recognizing that there's going to be a financial commitment to that as well.
Okay, great. I don't think there are any other questions coming in, so are you comfortable closing, or do you have anything else to share that you'd like to close with? Otherwise, I'll close it out.
No, I just would love to once again thank RNN for hosting this webinar series, and thanks to everyone who participated in today's webinar. And if you have any questions, I'll go back one slide. There's my contact information here, and I'll pass it on to you, Beth, for anything else you'd have to say on behalf of RNN.
Great. Thank you so much, Dallase. It was really, really so interesting to learn about what you do. Thank you so much, everybody, for your participation in today's webinar. As you saw Dallase's contact information, you can also go to GreenerU.com for more information. Our next webinar will be Wednesday, June 28th, featuring Steve Posner of Global Cycle, Inc., leading a presentation on wastewater recycling and the most environmentally friendly ways to treat and discharge wastewater. On behalf of RNN and GreenerU, we hope you enjoyed the presentation and have a great day. Thanks so much. Bye.